Okay, everybody, we're going to do our best to get through this. Chapter 13 is going to be your final exam. And so I'm going to take it in sections, probably a couple of lectures a week. And we will put this up on Moodle, and then you will be able to go to a link and hopefully get my lecture. So we're going to give this a try right now. Let's see how this works. All right, chapter 13, we're dealing with maladaptive behavior. This is behavior that's harmful to kids. They're doing things that are harmful to themselves and or others. In the first section, it's called the biopsychosocial model. In the biopsychosocial model, what I want you to keep in mind is divide this up into three parts. Bio meaning biological, psycho meaning the cognitive part of it, and social meaning their environment. Now, this whole semester I've talked to you about social being their relationships, their families, and that sort of thing. In chapter 13, I want you to think of social only two parts: socioeconomic status, the level of income, the poverty level or above, and neighborhood quality. So when you think of social, think of those two things. All right, the biological model, when people come at it from the biological perspective, they're looking at the cause. So we're talking about what may be causing kids to engage in maladaptive behavior or to have problems. Because there's a lot of disorders in this chapter that I'll cover with you. But for instance, if it's from a biological perspective, it could be something that the kid was born with. So he may have been born with bipolar disorder. That would be a chemical imbalance in the brain, and that would mean that it would probably have to be addressed with medication. So we're looking for something innate or inborn. It was already there. They didn't learn to be this way, so this model assumes that the problem is coming from within. So disorders like ADHD, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and some of those disorders, these people would assume that it's a biological cause, and the way you would want to treat that would be medication, and then secondary treatment would be counseling. Now the psychological and the social are going to be external factors that we assume causing the behavior or the maladaptive behavior for the client or the kids. And so in the psychological, we're talking about, remember, cognition. So we're talking about distorted thinking, where they justify behaviors that are maladaptive, they make excuses and so on, they transfer blame onto others and that sort of thing. Could be dealing with emotional distress. Emotional distress would be examples of things like abandonment of family, divorce, breakup in the home, abuse, neglect, things that we talked about in chapter 8, where the kid has some emotional problems associated with family issues, and they're thinking about that a lot, and then that causes other problems for them in the community, in school setting. In other words, they have a difficult time functioning at an appropriate level. And the third thing that would come under psychological would be inappropriate learning, and inappropriate learning would be things that they have learned and they've been taught by either their friends or their family to think the way they do, and that thinking then leads to problems. So a kid who grows up in a home in which a parent teaches them that you get even, well, you get revenge, or it's okay to steal or shoplift because the store's rich and we're poor, that would be inappropriate learning. And so I have a few examples here for you. Just look at those. So if you see these examples, you'll know that that's psychological. Their thinking justifies their behavior. Their behavior is maladaptive. Again, maladaptive behavior. It's harmful to themselves and or other people. The third part of the biopsychosocial model is the social factor. These are studies that are going to look at neighborhood quality, the inner city, high crime neighborhoods could affect the way these kids think and what they do. And the other part would be their socioeconomic status, which would be poverty level, and kids growing up with in families in which low income, and therefore that creates problems for them. All right, so let's kind of get into these things and look at them a little more closely. The first screen that I showed you talked about the biopsychosocial model, looking at it from a causal. In other words, these things or which of these things could be causing these kids to have these problems. This screen is how the kids respond to or react to the problems they're having. And so when you see this developmental psychopathology, these people are interested in studying the developmental path or psychological path that these kids are going through. So for instance, if a kid has ADHD but never gets treated for it, what they have found is in latter years, the kid's gonna possibly have oppositional defiant disorder. If oppositional defiant disorder is not addressed and they don't get help with that, they could be diagnosed with conduct disorder. I'll cover that one in detail a little later in the chapter, but the kids at the program in which I work, most of our kids have conduct disorder where they violated the rights of other people and basically they're crossed the line, they're breaking the law and so on. They find themselves in the judicial system. Well, the way they respond to this is divided into two categories. One is called internalizing, the other is called externalizing. So a response that would represent an internalizing was when people hold in, they turn it inward, they hold it, they brood about it, they think about it a lot, and it ends up causing problems for them, especially, make a note to yourself, especially depression. Because as they think about it, they spiral downward. It's called a negative cognitive set. And the more they dwell on it, the more they go into a deeper depression, which will cover some other issues associated with depression. Now these kids are going to try to control it, they're going to hold it in, but the problem's still there. They just haven't dealt with it, they haven't been in it, they haven't discussed it, and so it may erupt somewhere else, like in a passive-aggressive nature. An example might be a kid who's mad at the teacher, but instead of reacting back to the teacher, they brood about it all day. They get an opportunity, they key the teacher's car, they scratch the paint, and the teacher never makes the connection that kid's anger or whatever he was feeling, he holds it in and he uses it in a passive-aggressive manner rather than in the teacher's face in the classroom, which would be the second way, which is internalizing behavior. Externalizing behavior, exactly the opposite. These kids are kind of out of control. They lack self-control, and when they're upset, you're going to know about it. They're going to erupt. They're going to vent, and so it's immediate, and we call that overt behavior. And so it's in your face. Internalizing primarily females, externalizing primarily males. That's why males end up in the judicial system, adjudicated delinquent quite often, because when they're acting out, they're not thinking about the consequences, and they're doing it right out in the open, so they get caught. And so, while this one is called over-controlling, this one is called under-controlling. And by that, I don't mean they're under control, I mean they lack self-control. Just a general basis that you can expect would be typical. In early childhood, you're going to see problems with fear, because the world's a big place for small children, the fear of the unknown. Grown-ups are big people, and this would be quite normal. Some of the problems you're going to see in this chapter as they move into childhood, anything through elementary school, it's going to be the school problems are going to start to surface, the ADHD and the different issues associated with that, and their grades and their lack of attention and so on. It'll show up as school-related problems. But by the time we get to the group that we're talking about in adolescence, you're looking at issues that are much more serious, like substance abuse, drugs, and or alcohol. And so if you're given a choice on the test as far as some of these problems, who are more likely to have tried a drug, even experimentally, even just out of curiosity in the last 30 days, or more likely the teenage population would be in this category. So just keep that in mind. We'll be looking at these different categories in section 2, which basically section 1 is just laying the foundation for everything else that comes in the chapter. So I mentioned socioeconomic status earlier. One when it talks about that these kids have more problems than other kids, I wanna make it clear that that doesn't mean these kids are bad kids compared to other kids. It just means that they have a lack of resources and they have far more opportunity to engage in problematic behavior. And so if you had to compare these kids to the general population, you're gonna find that these kids are considered to be under control, which means they act out more quickly, talking about fighting, in a classroom, they might yell at the teacher, flip a desk over, storm out of a classroom. That sort of thing is what you're gonna see far more likely from this group of kids. If, on the other hand, the question is by gender, always remember test questions, we have kids' names, Tommy, Mary, that'll give you a clue as to the gender. So if the question is saying that Tommy is doing this and this, then you know that the males are more likely to act out, externalizing and vent what they're feeling. Females, on the other hand, more over-controlled, depression, holding in, and that's why females are far more likely, and I'll cover this also in a later section, far more likely to attempt suicide because the depressive state is correlated to suicide. Here's a simple little question for you on the test. What is the most common reason kids get sent to mental health clinics or the parents are seeking help for their kids? Number one diagnosis for kids in America is depression. More often than any other disorder, childhood, adolescent depression, number one. So be sure and mark it. If it gives you depression / something, then you're gonna add poor school performance, because usually if they're depressed, their grades are dropping, they're struggling in school. The two are related. But if you have to pick the best or the number one, you pick depression. Some more predictors that we're looking at in the section on introduction. Like I said, socioeconomic status plays a big part. We talked about it in Chapter 8, inner city, high crime. In Chapter 8, we also talked about parenting styles. So a lot of times these kids come from homes in which there's ineffective parenting, the authoritarian style, almost to the point of abusive, neglectful style where the parents are unavailable, they're not there teaching and providing for and assisting their kids in social skills development. So many of the kids we work with, that's a lot of the issues they deal with. Look at the history of the family. If the parents themselves have a history of a mental disorder, I talked about schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, major depressive disorder. If any of those are in the family history, it puts the kids at higher risk because we talked about behavior genetics and the likelihood of a genetic predisposition that the kids are born with that. That would be, of course, a biological point of view. Another interesting thing that they find in some of these studies is that families who never get married or whose relationships are quite unstable, maybe the mom moves from one relationship to the other, never getting married in the first place. These kids are at higher risk also, and it's a predictor that we look at in which these kids never really feel comfortable that this is their family unit, this is their mom, their dad, and they don't have that. And so in Chapter 8, we talked about the adjustment problems kids have with separated, divorced parenting and that 2-year window that I talked to you about. That still applies, and it carries on into Chapter 13 as we go into great detail as to what may be causing some of these problems that the kids have related to their situation and why they behave the way they do. Before I get into the next section, I want to take a minute and just give you a few little test-taking tips as you prepare for the final exam. Just a reminder, we won't do comprehensive this semester. Your entire test will come from Chapter 13. The introduction section that I just covered with you is going to be what we think may be causing the kids to have the problems they have, and just a general description of some of the ways they respond and react to those problems. The section on drugs, substance abuse, which includes alcohol, is gonna be the biggest part of your test, so pay attention to that section. You wanna pay attention to the categories of the drugs. The drugs are gonna fall into different categories: stimulants, depressants, and hallucinogenic. You wanna pay attention to whether a drug is addictive or not, or whether there's a psychological dependence that could be associated with that drug. Third, you want to pay attention to the symptoms. What type of reactions do kids show or symptoms as they find themselves on these drugs? And so keep those things in mind as we go through this section, and remember, the majority of your tests will come from this section. There's just a lot of information there. When I complete this section, the third major section is going to be juvenile delinquency, what it means to be adjudicated delinquent, the different levels of juvenile delinquency, what types of behaviors you could expect by gender, and the court systems, and some statistics related to that area. And then the fourth major category in the chapter will be dealing with depression and suicide. They treat that as one category, and we'll cover that in great detail in another session later in the week or next week. And then finally, there's a section dealing with eating disorders, the different types of eating disorders, and that'll wrap up this chapter. And so I hope this is going to work for us. I hope it's helpful. I hope that this gets us started as we try to wrap this semester. I appreciate you working with me. Remember, use your email addresses, get your movie assignment, pay attention to your syllabus. Those dates still apply with the movie assignment. Get it in. Some of the students already have, and it's working just fine. So if you have a problem with it, email me. Also, check your Moodle account every day. I'll be posting information on a weekly basis as to what to expect this week. So for right now anyway, I just wanted to get this first video out to you and get some feedback from you and see if it's clear enough. You can see it, you can hear me clearly. I welcome any response. So that'll be it for today, and I'll see you next time.